What's up, everybody? So today we're going to continue our look at Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue here, and I'll be looking at Chapter 1. Chapter 1, even though it's a couple pages long, it's very dense, so I'm hoping to break this lecture down into two segments. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, I want to talk about his main thesis, and that's found on page 2. And it, in his own words, is, "In the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described." This is not going to make sense to you yet because you haven't looked at his thought experiment. So let's jump right into that. Hopefully after the thesis, his main argument is going to make more sense. So, in the structure of this chapter, we have on the first page our thought experiment, which I'll discuss shortly. Then on page 2, we have a critique of phenomenology, existentialism, and analytic fill. Then on page 2, we also have the thesis stated. Page 3, MacIntyre is going to give a bit of a discussion about history. Page 3, he's also going to object to his thesis and then respond to it. And then after that, he's going to put forth what I call a disquieting suggestion, which is also the title of the chapter. So let's talk about this thought experiment here. This should be really interesting to you. What he's laying out is basically a world where the natural sciences have lost all their context. A world where our physiology textbook, our chemistry textbook, our theories of quantum mechanics, all of these things are fragmented. So you might think about going into a basement and finding just a model of what looks like an atom, or what we would call an atom today, just finding a plastic model of it, or finding a clip of Erwin Schrödinger talking about his famous cat thought experiment, or any other of these things. So Stephen Hawking talking about a black hole, finding just short fragments of video clips of them talking about those things. I mean, we can go on and on here. For example, I've written down in the margin, think about a theory of gravity without math, or relativity without its contextual physics involved. These would be fragments. Now the question is, what would we do with such things? How would we understand them? Would we understand them at all? How would we come to conclusions about what they are? See, the problem that MacIntyre is pointing out is that we would read in our own thoughts to those things. We would be reading in to the theory of relativity, or the fragments of relativity, our own thoughts. Who knows what that could be? I mean, that's what he's saying that the moral discourse in today's language is. It would be like a world where we have fragments of the natural sciences, but we read in whatever we want to them, precisely because we lack that unifying context. For the model of the atom, we lack that description of what the model is. For a video about Stephen Hawking talking about black holes, we lack the mathematical context in this thought experiment, of course. We lack the mathematical context of what those black holes are. We lack Stephen Hawking's, the rest of his corpus of work. So that's going to be this thought experiment. Now let's take a look at my notes here, which are linked in the video description below. So I put forth another similar situation. Think of a monk in a bomb shelter finding holy scripture that he's never encountered, or an ancient church father he's never encountered. What would he do? He wouldn't have any context with which to, suppose of course, he doesn't have any context with which to weigh this. He would simply copy those things down. He would copy down the writings. He wouldn't be able to truly comprehend them. So this would be very similar. We can think about in this world of the natural sciences, we can think about going to school and being told to copy down these equations and think about them, yet we don't really know what we're doing or what we're talking about. We're just talking about these fragments. And the key word in this thought experiment is the word context. So MacIntyre, to quote him, he says, "Many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost. There would appear to be an element of arbitrariness." And what he's talking about there is the fact that we wouldn't have the full context for applying the words and the theories in the natural sciences, we wouldn't really have a clue to their purpose. And that's because like I said, there's no unifying glue. There's no coherent domain or discipline of science. There's no, to take a quantum physics example, there would be no unified end to what quantum physics is. We would just have parts of quantum physics, and we wouldn't know what the point of those parts would be. So that's what he's getting at with this thought experiment. And it took me a while to wrap my head around this, precisely because it's written in such an abstract way. But what I think that it is really helpful is to think about specific examples, like how I mentioned quantum physics, or the black hole stuff, or the theory of gravity. I mean, get creative and think about your own examples off the top of your head, and think about what would happen if we just had parts of that theory or parts of that scientific discovery and didn't have the full context. Another great example would be Darwinian selection. Imagine we come across a piece of paper, or ripped out of a book or something, and it just has a picture of a human coming from the different species that came before the human. Forget it's Homo Deus, or no, that's not it, but Homo erectus. And think about, we just had that picture. Or think about, we have some like a big tree of life, but we didn't have any of the context to it. We had no idea what Darwin's theory of evolution was. What would we make of those pictures? Well, we would inevitably simply read into those pictures what we want. I mean, you can get really crazy with this. Perhaps people would read in that aliens put that picture down on Earth or something. I mean, it's really endless what you can read into those things when you lack the coherent underlying theory. So that's exactly what MacIntyre is getting at here. And his main point with this is that this is the state of moral discourse today. This is the state of ethics today. So keep that in mind. That is a crucial point. It's going to outline or underlie the entire book. That is like, he's setting the stage here for the rest of the book. So keep that in mind. Keep that analogy between this thought experiment at the natural sciences and moral discourse in mind. So let's turn to the next page, and let's look at his critique of three philosophical schools. So, and those are going to be existentialism, phenomenology, and analytic philosophy. So he's going to go down on page 2, and he's going to say, nor again would phenomenology or existentialism be able to discern anything wrong. And what he means here, again, this is in my notes, so follow along, is that these three schools are engaged with the status quo. They're engaged in sort of a conceptual analysis in what they deal with. So let me spell that out briefly. So phenomenology is going to bracket things, and it's going to analyze those things, and it's not going to go outside of those things. Of course, this is a very general statement, and it's going to be true of the phenomenology that MacIntyre is reacting against. It may not be true of phenomenology today. I don't know. I don't do that kind of work, but this is MacIntyre's argument again. Analytic philosophy is going to analyze the linguistics and the language that we use. It's not going to go outside of that language. And existentialism is very pragmatic and deals with the here and now and how to live. Now, this is very important because MacIntyre's point with this is that these three schools of thought won't help us to discern the problem with moral language because they don't go outside of the moral language. They're just engaged with dealing in the here and now, analyzing things in the here and now. So the point is that we can't use those three schools of thought to look at the state of ethics today and figure out what's wrong. The real question that you can pose is, how would these three schools fare in our world of the scientific collapse? I think that's very crucial, and you can think about that. So for example, think about how phenomenology or analytic philosophy would deal with the state of science in our thought experiment. How would they interact? Would they help us to discern that science is broken? or fragmented, would they help us to be able to figure out Darwin's theory when all we had were those pictures that I mentioned? I don't think so, and that's MacIntyre's main point. So let's take a look at the text again. Again, I'm on page 2 for those following along. So he's going to quote the thesis about halfway down on page 2, and then he's going to spell out a little bit what I mentioned above with the 3 schools of thought. So moving on to page 3, I think the most important part here is his discussion of history. And this is again at the top of page 3. So his point with this discussion is that we have to understand how we got to this dire situation in ethics before coming up with a solution. And again, think back to the thought experiment here. In the first stage of the thought experiment, the sciences flourished. There was a prehistory to this collapse. In the second stage, they suffered some sort of catastrophe, whatever you think. You can use your imagination. And in stage 3, or 2B, whatever you want to call it, they were discovered, these fragments were discovered. And now suppose we add a third stage on where they were restored in their original but damaged form. This is going to be just like somebody going in and discovering a fragment and trying to interpret it. Now, all of 3 of these stages are going to presuppose non-neutral standards. So there's going to be what we call a good period where the sciences flourished, a catastrophe denoting something bad happening, and a restoration denoting a fragmented science, which also is not as good as the prehistory. So MacIntyre's point with this is that history is informed by these standards which it presupposes. It's not value neutral, and that's going to be crucial. So this division of this narrative presupposes definitions of success, failure, and order/disorder. This is very important for MacIntyre, and he's going to develop this line of thinking throughout the book. He's going to develop this idea of value embedded in context, value embedded in history, value embedded in even nature to a certain extent. And so what he's getting at here is if we want to understand what has happened in our thought experiment or today in ethics in the real world, we have to be able to look at history with presupposing values. We can't take this almost Rawlsian, or whatever you want to call it, value neutral approach that's so common today. We have to look back at history and realize that there was a good era, there was a catastrophe, and then there is a order/disorder going on. Now again, this is all assuming that MacIntyre is even correct in his approach. This is assuming that his main thesis that he's put forth, again, that the state of ethical discourse is in grave disorder. That's assuming that he's correct. So with that in mind, I think that that would be a good place to stop the lecture and pick up next time on what exactly are the objections to MacIntyre's thesis and what exactly he's going to do to respond to those. But before doing that, let's recap a little bit to just kind of refresh what's going on, because I know there's a ton of information. So again, first he put forth a crucial thought experiment about the state of the natural sciences in a supposed hypothetical world where everything, we lost a context to it. All we had were fragments. Now, in that world, we aren't going to understand things. We're only going to, as I use the word incantations, we're only going to have incantations. We're just going to say these things. We're just going to talk about gravity or the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics without understanding what's going on. We're only going to be able to read in and interpret. We're going to read into those theories or those fragments and interpret them with our already presupposed biases and our already presupposed context, whatever it may be. My suggestion to you is to understand this thought experiment, really get specific with examples. I gave examples of black holes and Stephen Hawking, Darwin's theory of evolution, the theory of gravity, a little toy model of an atom. In all these things, when we lack the context, we won't know what they're for. We won't understand them. And so think about your own solution or your own examples. Maybe write them out, jot them down, talk with other people, and ask and think about what exactly is going on in this world. If you were living in that world today, what would you be doing? And again, the point of that thought experiment is that that's a direct analogy to the state of ethics today. Again, another recap or another piece of the summary is that we have to go outside. We have to go outside of the box or think outside of the box to understand this world. Phenomenology, existentialism, and analytic philosophy aren't going to help us because those are dealing with the here and now and doing a sort of conceptual analysis. Again, that's an overgeneralization. I don't want to comment on just a huge swath of those fields, but that's MacIntyre's general argument. You can wrestle with him on that. If he's wrong, let me know in the context, or let me know in the comments below why you think so. If you think he's right, let me know. I'd love to hear. I tend to think that from my studies, MacIntyre does have a great point here, but maybe we'll leave that for another time. So again, then he's going to go on, and the third thing I pointed out was history. History is not value neutral. And to understand the state of disorder of our ethical discourse, we have to presuppose values. We have to presuppose a point in time where our ethical discourse was not disordered and it was good. We have to presuppose values which deem or which allow us to point out in history the point where our ethical discourse collapsed. And we have to have values deeming where there is order and where there is disorder in our ethical discourse. So with that in mind, that's a quick summary of the video. I'm going to end this, and next time we're going to talk about the objections to MacIntyre's thesis, his response, and his wrap-up of the chapter. Again, if you like the video, like, comment, subscribe. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'm super excited to continue this project.